So now that you've learned the stages of meiosis and what happens during meiosis, we need to talk a little bit more about the daughter cells that are produced at the end of meiosis. Because remember, we've said that meiosis formed these kind of specialized cells called gametes. And gametes are sex cells. And so these are eggs, which are also called ova in females, and sperm in males. Now, more specifically, meiosis in females is known as oogenesis. So oogenesis is meiosis that's happening in stem cells in females. And this is happening in the ovaries. And so the ovaries are the gonads of the female. In males, meiosis is called spermatogenesis, and it's occurring in the gonads, which are the testes. Now, the original cell that goes into meiosis is a stem cell. And stem cells are cells that are not fully differentiated yet. And so these are cells that have the ability to turn into other cells in the body. And these stem cells are also called germ cells. So these two terms are used interchangeably. So when we draw this little diagram where we show a cell that goes through the S phase of interphase, and then it goes through the first round of meiosis, and then that cell goes through the second round of meiosis. The original cell that we're talking about, this is that stem cell. So this is that germ cell that is kind of hanging out in either the ovaries or the testes, getting ready to go through meiosis. Now in males, this stem cell is called a spermatogonium. In females, the stem cell is called an oogonium. Now, one thing to keep in mind is that this stem cell actually goes through mitosis first, and that's because it has to basically create a replacement for itself. So it creates another stem cell, and then it creates this cell, which then goes through meiosis. So the stem cell goes through mitosis first to create two daughter cells. One of those daughter cells is going to become a new stem cell that can then go through meiosis later on. The other daughter cell is going to go ahead and go through meiosis right at that moment that it is produced. Now I want to draw your attention to this picture up here. And this picture is showing you the egg, which is this kind of large circular cell here. And then these smaller cells here are the sperm. And you'll notice that there is a significant size difference between an egg and a sperm. And we're going to talk about why that is important on the next couple of slides. So let's talk about spermatogenesis, which is just meiosis happening in males. So meiosis in males. And remember that it's occurring in the testes. So the testes are the male gonad. And so in the testes, we have the spermatogonium, which is that stem cell, which we also call that germ cell. And remember, that cell goes through mitosis first. And in doing so, it creates a replacement for itself. And it creates a cell that can then go through meiosis. The cell that goes through meiosis, you'll see that we end up with those 4 daughter cells. And those 4 daughter cells are going to further develop into the spermatozoa, which we more commonly just refer to as sperm. Now this process starts at puberty and it continues until pretty much the day the man dies. Now, sperm production does typically decrease with age, but technically a man can father a child up until the day he dies. Because his body just keeps producing sperm. Now for each one of those spermatogoniums, so for each one of those stem cells that goes through meiosis, we get 4 viable sperm. So that means that we get 4 functional sperm for each one of these stem cells going through meiosis. And you can see that down here. So these are those 4 daughter cells, which in this case, the daughter cells are more specifically referred to as sperm. Now, when it comes to reproduction, females are more complicated in more ways than one. So first of all, the stem cell is called an oogonium. And so this is the stem cell. And this cell exists in the ovary. So remember that in females, the gonad is the ovary. Now, the oogonium actually starts to go through meiosis prior to birth. So when a baby girl is developing in utero, her ovaries are already functional and they're already starting to go through this process of meiosis to start producing these gametes. Now, the cells pause at prophase 1 before the daughter is born, so before the baby girl is born. So you may have heard that girls are born with all of the eggs that they're ever going to make, and that is true. So if a woman is pregnant with a baby girl, environmental factors that affect the woman's body are actually not only affecting her and her fetus, but they're actually potentially affecting her future grandchildren. So this oogenesis pauses before birth, and then it starts up again at puberty. But it doesn't kind of start all at once. So every month after the woman goes through her first menstrual cycle, a couple of these eggs are going to kind of go back into or restart that process of meiosis. But those cells are going to stop again at metaphase 2. And interestingly, the oogonium is not going to completely finish all of the steps of meiosis 2 unless it is fertilized. So it does not actually go through all of the steps of meiosis until the egg is fertilized by a sperm. So after puberty, as I mentioned, these eggs are going to start developing each month. And then this is going to keep happening, and this is part of the regular menstrual cycle, and it's going to keep happening until the woman reaches menopause. And menopause typically occurs when the woman is in like her 40s or 50s. Now, evolutionarily, the reason why it's believed that women go through menopause, but men don't go through a similar type of, cessation of making these gametes is because a lot more of the burden of reproduction falls on the female. Because remember that a female doesn't only have to just make gametes, she has to be able to carry the pregnancy, give birth, and also feed the infant. And so the kind of the theory behind menopause is that the ability to get pregnant shuts down at a point in a woman's life where it's likely that she's not going to be alive long enough to basically take care of that child until it's independent. Now, in modern society, we have, other caregivers, the dad sticks around sometimes, and we have kind of artificial milk in the form of formula. But if you think back to, evolutionarily just a couple of generations ago, we didn't have that technology, and we didn't necessarily have the cultural ideals in place in order to support a woman who was, maybe older or unable to carry a child. So this picture kind of summarizes what happens during meiosis. So once again, we have that oogonium, which is the stem cell. And it's first going to go through mitosis because it has to make a replacement for itself so that this cell can then in the future go through mitosis again. Meanwhile, the other cell that is produced during mitosis is going to end up going through meiosis. Now remember that this process starts before a baby is even born. So the ovaries in a female fetus are going to start going through meiosis in order to start producing these eggs. However, the process stops or kind of pauses at prophase 1. So this is before the first round of cell division has even occurred. Now, after puberty, so this is after the woman has started her menstrual cycle, the process is going to start back up again, but then it pauses again in metaphase 2. Now, if the cell does not get fertilized, then this is actually the end of the line and meiosis doesn't continue. It only continues all the way through to the formation of the final ovum if the cell gets fertilized by a sperm. So one thing to note here is during oogenesis, the division of the cells is not equal. So you can see here, so after meiosis 1 happens, so this is our first round of cell division. you'll see that one of the cells is bigger and one is smaller. And that's because the chromosomes still separate into these two daughter cells. But this cell on the left here, it gets more of the cytoplasm and organelles and just resources in general. Because if this cell becomes fertilized by the sperm, it has to have the resources in order to start going through mitosis for embryonic development to essentially make a baby. And so this cell needs things like ribosomes to make protein and mitochondria to make ATP. And so this one cell gets kind of the majority of those resources, and the other cell is called a polar body. And these polar bodies are not viable. So they cannot be fertilized by a sperm, and they're just too small. They don't have the resources necessary to essentially go through cell division to form an embryo and then a fetus. So the main reason why we even have these polar bodies is just to have a way to get rid of those extra chromosomes that we made earlier in the process. All right, so these are just like packages of chromosomes. That essentially just get thrown away. We'll just say that degrade. All right, because we need to make sure that this cell over here, that the secondary oocyte, only has the number of chromosomes that it needs to have. Because remember, if a zygote ends up with too many chromosomes, it causes problems with development. Now, if that secondary oocyte gets fertilized and it basically induces that mature ovum to then go through the second round of meiosis. And so meiosis 2 would happen kind of down here. And once again, the daughter cells, the kind of the division of resources is not equal here. So we end up with one really big mature ovum that has all of those resources. So it's got more of the cytoplasm, more of the organelles, more ATP, more nutrients, just all that stuff that it needs in order to essentially grow a baby. And then we make another polar body. And remember, this polar body is just to get rid of these extra chromosomes that we need to make sure are not in the developing embryo. And so that polar body is not viable. It cannot be fertilized by a sperm, and it cannot develop into an embryo and a fetus. And the same thing happens with this polar body over here. It might still go through that second round of meiosis, but it's going to form just two more polar bodies, which once again are not viable. So to summarize, during oogenesis, each oogonium, remember this is the stem cell in the ovary, so each one of these stem cells only produces one viable gamete or one viable ovum. The other three daughter cells are known as polar bodies, and these are smaller cells. They're really produced just to separate out those extra chromosomes to get them out of the way, but they don't have much cytosol and they don't really have any organelles, and they are not viable for reproduction. So it's literally just packages of chromosomes that get thrown away. But the viable gamete, so the ovum that actually gets all of those organelles and resources and is able to be fertilized by the sperm, it is the one that is able to basically make a baby. So if you were to go back and look at that picture that was a couple slides back where it showed the ovum as this kind of big cell and then the sperm were very small in comparison, that's because sperm are built for speed. All right, so the ultimate goal of a sperm is just to deliver a package of DNA from the male's body into the female's body so that it can get to the egg. Its only job is to transport that DNA. Once it transports that DNA to the cell, its job is done. The ovum, however, and so the ovum is just another word for the egg, it is responsible for essentially everything else. So it's responsible for all the mitosis that is associated with embryonic development. So the ovum has to have those resources, including energy and proteins and enzymes, et cetera, in order to go through mitosis to ultimately form a baby.